There's plenty of bad art out there, and plenty of apologists who stand up for it. Art is subjective, but is there any limit to it? For instance, take this, a painting where a flaw is so glaringly obvious that it begs to be noticed. Do you see it? There it is, and it's asking to be swatted. Before we begin, if you enjoy our content, please hit the like and subscribe button. Commissioning portraits was not a cheap thing to do. It was a major expense, and even nobles would sit only a handful of times in their entire lives. Imagine their surprise when the painter would have unveiled the painting with that nasty fly up top. What's the reason for it? He would have needed a freakishly phenomenal explanation to persuade the commissioner. If you've ever been on planet Earth for any amount of time, you know this. Flies are inconvenient, and if one sticks around for long, maybe even infuriating. It goes against our instincts to not flounder our hands, trying to pick a fight with an aerial nuisance. So, how come this painting has remained safe after all these years? After all, it's a work that shows an unknown subject painted by an unknown artist. The painting, however, does have an official title. The portrait of a woman of the Hofer family is dated to the late 15th century by an artist working in Swabia. For those who don't know, it is a historical, cultural, and linguistic region covering southwestern Germany, part of Switzerland, and part of France. As can be expected, it's hard to track down an artist for the work, given the amount of land we have to cover. The artwork was not officially signed. The look at the top left corner, it says Geborn Hoferin, which translates to Born a Hofer. You might be thinking, well, we can just go through the Hofer family and figure this out. Well, not exactly. The problem is that Hofer was a very common family name in southwestern Germany at the time, so we wouldn't know where to start. This brings us to the question of what we do have. We pretty much just have the canvas and its contents. So let's get into it. Let's start with the subject, a woman not young but youngish. How did I reach that conclusion? If you look closely, she has little to no lines or wrinkles, whereas her facial features are not that of a young girl. So, youngish is probably a good estimate. She also has quite an attractive face with lavish skin, a fair complexion, and a slight warmth. The warmth is perfectly captured in her mouth, slightly posed as if it's about to register a smile. Notice her solemn pose and clothing. She looks like a woman of some stature, calmly sitting in a graceful position with a silky smooth garb and elegant yet expensive garments adorning her. Take a close look at the black fabric. There are extensive swirling patterns sewn into the cloth. It's a brocade of the finest order. Producing this sort of fabric would have been quite expensive, further adding credence to her being of noble origins. Look at how the intricately designed metal claps hold all these layers together. Look at how seamlessly the garments are woven around her neck. Another interesting thing to note is her cuff. It is fur-lined, which was a rarity even for rich folk, so she must have belonged to some of the most lucrative families in the region. If you look at her hands, you'll notice that she also has a bunch of rings. It's rare to see portraits of working-class subjects anyway, but this is an exhibition of wealth. And you'll notice that the background is not completely rigid either. It also has its fair share of patterns on it. That much exquisite fabric in the frame makes one question. Could she have been related to a rich textile merchant? The technique and mastery of the artist draw even more attention to these details. Every eyelash is picked out and rendered with masterful strokes. You can pick out strands of feathers in her cuff. The effort required to build this pristine image would have been immense. Imagine the amount of servants and resources. The one piece of clothing that dominates the work is the headdress. How can one avoid it? The swirling cloth sweeps and folds, acquiring a unique shape that is, quite honestly, mesmerizing. The sharp edges, the sense of depth and volume, and the play of light and shadow that it conjures is a truly unique phenomenon. The artist must have painstakingly arranged it in this way to maximize its potential. How do I know? Because you can pick out individual stitches in the garment. That tells you that the artist paid enormous attention to even the tiniest of details. The only plain section of the cloth, above the head, is adorned to give more texture, and the fastening pins add a little bit more character. As for the fly, it's painted with just as much care, its translucent wings and legs producing a clear shadow. It's incredibly realistic, but the question remains: why? Art historians insist that the artist did have his reasons. The easiest explanation is that it was just a silly joke. For anyone who sees the painting, the first instinct is to release your hand in the direction, swatting and swiping in the air so that the insect would leave it alone. By tricking us into believing that it is an actual fly, the painter is showing off the delicacy of his technique. But tooting one's horn makes sense when one is painting for the masses. But even then, you might be asking why go through the trouble of deceiving people into thinking there's an actual fly on the canvas. To better understand this need for recognition, let's hear from the Roman philosopher and naturalist Pliny the Elder, who recalls a tale about the legendary Greek painter Zeuxis. Zeuxis, one of the first to introduce perspective using light and shadow, unveiled a painting of grapes that was so real and lifelike that birds came down to peck at it. Now, this tale probably is just a poetic rendition, but it gets the point across, that artists can easily get caught up with the need for recognition. But this was commissioned by an obviously affluent family. They would not have stood for such boastful gimmicks on their behalf. Now, that doesn't rule out deceiving audiences as a real motivation, but it does make us think that there might be a better explanation in addition to this one. This is where we enter the realm of symbols. In the Western tradition of visual art, a fly symbolizes mortality, a kind of minor memento mori. As to why a fly has anything to do with death, only God knows. But the one other thing that makes this interpretation interesting is the bunch of plants that the subject holds in her hand. Mysotis or scorpion grasses are colloquially called forget-me-nots. Now, in German you call them Vergiss mein nicht, which is a literal translation. So, maybe the artist was using both the plants and the fly as emblems for remembrance. As to why he would need to play this card on a live portraiture subject is not known. Since we know so little about it, we cannot say whether or not the work was painted posthumously. Maybe it commemorated the life of a person, in which case it would be an appropriate symbol. Or maybe the woman was very much alive and had an incredible sense of humor. Visual art of the German-speaking peoples in the 15th and 16th centuries was never held in high regard, but in recent years we have noticed a resurgence. Thanks to works like these, the German Renaissance is attracting more and more interest. If you like this video, please leave a like. What do you think of the portrait? Leave your thoughts in the comments. For more content, subscribe to the channel and stick around for more intriguing, exciting, and mysterious stories about art. That's it for now. We'll see you in the next one.